Welcome to Faith and Freedom, an audio feature produced by the Wagner Faith and Freedom Center located on the campus of Spring Arbor University. The Wagner Faith and Freedom Center serves as the nation's academic voice for faith, family, and freedom. And now here's your host for Faith and Freedom, Professor William Wagner.
Welcome to Faith and Freedom. I'm your host, Professor William Wagner. Today we consider a question that strikes at the very heart of ordered liberty. It strikes at the very heart of human dignity and the future of our republic. Who holds the authority to control and direct the upbringing of children? Is it the parent of the child, or is it the state? Folks, this is not just a policy debate. It's a moral question. And it's a constitutional question. And at its core, it's a biblical question. So I was reading some recent data in a survey by the State of Educational Opportunity in America. And that survey reveals what I think is a nation intention. Parents increasingly desire greater choice. And that just makes so much sense. You know, we as parents, are always wanting more flexibility and we're wanting more control over our child's education. Yet, guess right, folks, we know what's happening. At the same time, what are these parents encountering? They're encountering systematic barriers. They're encountering declining engagement and institutional resistance from all kinds of government institutions. And that tension, I think, reflects something deeper than just mere educational policy. I think, once again, as we've talked about on this program from time to time, that it's a collision of worldviews going on. It is certainly revealing a collision of worldviews when you see the state and the power of the state crashing into the instincts and the natural instincts of a parent wanting to direct and control the upbringing, especially the education of their child. And so on one side stands a biblical and a constitutional vision, one that affirms parental authority as the primary authority for raising a child. And, on the other side of the debate stands a growing and I think a troubling secular framework, one that increasingly locates the authority in some kind of bureaucratic system or too often in a state actor, like a school counselor or some kind of state authority. So let's begin, as we always do on this program, with God. Scripture teaches us in the Psalms, Psalm 127, children are heritage from the Lord. Children belong first to God, not to the state. And God entrusts parents, not government institutions, with the upbringing of a child. And so Proverbs 22:6 commands, train up a child in the way he should go. And Ephesians 6:4 directs fathers especially, and by extension parents, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's not a suggestion, folks. It's a divine assigned duty, the very words of God. And where God assigns duty, he necessarily delegates and grants authority. And so parents, therefore, I think we possess not only the responsibility, but the constitutional right to direct the education and formation of our children. Now, to be sure, we can delegate that to the public school, but we can also delegate it to a private Christian school, or we can home educate. The point is, it's the parent's choice of where that delegation occurs, if at all. And so any system that undermines that authority stands in tension with God's design. And so our constitutional order, reflects this truth. And that's one of the great things about this nation is that our Constitution, very often, if we go and look at the original meaning, and the original understanding of what our framers were dealing with and when they put together this great nation. It so often reflects what perspective that God would have us have. And so for over a century, the United States Supreme Court has recognized parental authority as the fundamental liberty interest. Not just a fundamental liberty interest, but an inalienable liberty interest, something that precedes government. In Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court declared that the child is not the mere creature of the state. That single sentence captures a foundational principle in American law and American constitutional jurisprudence. Government does not own children. Government does not create children. Government does not possess the original authority over children. Parents do. That principle flows all the way through our jurisprudence. And jurisprudence is one of those great big old fancy legal words that means legal philosophy. So that principle flows through our legal philosophy of our nation. If we had more time, we would talk about all these cases. Maybe someday in another program we will. Meyer versus Nebraska, Pierce versus Society of Sister, Wisconsin's versus Yoger, Troxell versus Granville, and then Mahmoud case, the most recently, the Supreme Court reaffirmed these same constitutional principles. Each one of these cases affirms that parental authority in education is not granted by some state regime. It's recognized as pre-political and fundamental. That is, it's unalienable. It comes from God. It was here from the beginning of time, and it's going to be here until Jesus returns. In other words, the Constitution protects what God has already ordained. Oh boy, so what's happening yet today? Today, that foundational principle seems increasingly under pressure. I certainly see it in the courts as we especially work in the U.S. Supreme Court. Across the country, we see increasing efforts to centralize education control, where government regimes want to control every aspect of the upbringing of a child. And along the way, they are intentionally trying to limit parental input. They're also limiting the availability of parents to even know what their children are being taught under the government authority. So we're talking about standardized curricula and marginalizing faith-based education at the very least. But then what I'm seeing at the very worst is, some pretty, far out there ideas that have nothing to do with education being used by government regimes to help formulate a child's character and indeed their very identity sometimes without the permission of the parent and without the knowledge of parent. And sometimes, the teachers and those that are working for these state regimes are, by policy prohibited from even sharing that kind of information with parents. In my view, that's a very, very dangerous thing. That's one of the things that you see if you study history, where a nation has gone and come under the control of tyranny, where there's tyranny. What do we need to do? Well, we need to control the child. We need to control the upbringing of the child. We need to control what the child thinks about who they are. And so what's going on in the United States right now is a subtle, but in my view, a dangerous shift that parents especially ought to stay aware of. The question is no longer how can the state support parents, but rather how much authority will the state allow parents to retain? And that's not what our Constitution provides for. That's an inversion of the constitutional right of a parent to control and direct the upbringing of the child. That inversion is both constitutionally suspect and morally unsound. Because parental authority is not a permission granted by the government, folks. It is a right that precedes government. It's an unalienable liberty that was here even before we had a nation. And so educational freedom is not merely about school choice, folks. It's about human flourishing. And when parents are free to direct and control their child's education, guess what? Children are formed in accordance with truth. Families are strengthened, communities are enriched, and perhaps most importantly, liberty is preserved. On the other hand, when we allow a state regime to constrain freedom, conscience gets burdened or suppressed completely, faith is always marginalized, and the state always seems to exceed its proper role. And so I have said this before a number of times in my writings and on programs like this. The role of government is not to replace the parent, but to protect the parent's ability to fulfill their God-given responsibility. At stake in this huge collision of worldviews, at stake in this debate, is nothing less than the formation of the next generation. Will we be allowed in the next generation to raise our own children? Or will the child be raised by a government bureaucrat? Because, folks, education is never neutral. They may say it is, but it never is. It always forms the mind. It always shapes the heart. It always frames beliefs of a child. And ultimately, it shapes a child's worldview. That is why it's the parent and not a state regime that should be in charge of raising a child. If parents advocate their responsibility, or if the state assumes it, the consequences have always been very profound throughout world history. Because whoever shapes the child shapes the future, folks. And that is why the battle over education at its core is a battle for truth. And so I'm going to, in concluding here, I want to have a little call to action for you out there. What must we do? Well, first, we must reclaim some clarity out there. Parents must understand that their authority is God-given. It's constitutionally protected, and it's morally non-transferable to a state regime. Second, I would say that we must act courageously. And for parents, that means advocating for school choice, standing for school choice, supporting faith-based education, holding institutions accountable, and participating in our own child's activity if it has anything to do with the formation of who they are as a person or their character. And so, finally, I think we must lead faithfully, because this, we talk a lot about legal issues on this program, folks, but this is not simply a legal issue. It's a matter of stewardship. It's a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of truth. And one day, each of us will give an account for how we fulfilled that stewardship. And so let me leave you with this truth. A free society depends on free families. And free families depend upon parental authority rightly understood and faithfully exercised. If we lose that, we do not merely lose educational freedom. We risk losing the very foundations of liberty itself. So thank you for joining me today on Faith and Freedom. I'm William Wagner, your host, and I encourage you to stand firm, think clearly, and live faithfully. Why? Because truth matters. Our children matter, and freedom matters. And we want to preserve all that for the next generation. Until next time, this is Professor William Wagner for Faith, for Freedom, and for such a time as this.